This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at BakerStreetIrregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Boscombe Valley was mysterious, Shoscombe Place was old, and the lodge was hysterical, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Was Holmes more of a tea drinker or a coffee fancier? And what are all of the alcoholic drinks mentioned in the stories?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 244, Watson's Medical Career. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Burt, are you firmly and fully medicated at this point?
Yes, and I have a neighbor who can take over my practice if I need it.
Perfect. Well, as they say in the medical field, practice makes pregnant. That's just in the OBGYN field. Well, if you would like the show notes for this episode, they can be found at ihose.co/trifles244. Anything you would like to say to us therein, you can do. You can also leave us an email if you'd like to email anything to us. We are at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. Of course, all the social networks and whatnot are on our homepage as well. And don't forget to support the show for as little as $1 a month. We do appreciate all of our Patreon supporters, and we look forward to having more. Well, inasmuch as we have covered some of the medical capabilities of Dr. Watson in the past, I think we were here on episode, I haven't noted it in the show notes. When we were here last talking about I think it was like back on episode 29 or something like that, a long time ago, where we talked about Watson and brandy mostly. And by the way, even though I am fuzzy on the recall of which episode it was that we talked about that, check the show notes because I will have a reference to exactly which episode that was, and you can go back and listen to that. But I wanted to bring out an essay that I was rereading, an essay that I haven't read in a long time, quite frankly, from H.W. Bell's Baker Street Studies. This was a book that was first published in 1934 by John Constable and Sons, Constable and Company Limited. And there were essays in there by Dorothy Sayers, Helen Simpson, Vernon Rendell, Vincent Sterrett, Ronald A. Knox, A.G. MacDonald, S.C. Roberts, and of course H.W. Bell himself. Many of those names will be familiar to Sherlockians, and the one we picked out was an essay by Helen Simpson. Not a name I recall popping up with great regularity in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts since this time. But Ms. Simpson wrote an essay called Medical Career and Capacities of Dr. J. H. Watson. And I thought it was worth looking at some portions of this essay. Not the entire essay, because I think that would be a little too long and drawn out, and in some cases a little repetitive. But I thought, why don't we take a look at Simpson's work here and see what we can make of it?
Yes. You know, and it's a wonderful exploration because if you just leave it to Watson, he's never going to tell you very much about himself. And in fact, we've talked in the past about the high regard Sherlock Holmes had for his own abilities. Watson is the complete opposite. Watson tells us, I think in The Creeping Man, Holmes was a man of habits, and I had become one of his habits, a comrade upon whose nerve he could place some reliance, a whetstone for his mind. If I irritated him by a certain methodical slowness in my mentality, that irritation only served to make his own flame-like intuitions and impressions flash up the more vividly and swiftly. Such was my humble role in our alliance. Well, not so, because, you know, we learned from Helen Simpson's essay here that this very first remark that Watson had about himself understated his accomplishments. You know, he tells us he meets in Study in Scarlet Stamford, young Stamford, who was a dresser underneath him at Bart's. And of course, I always thought that being a dresser at Bart's meant you helped someone on with their coat. But no.
No, it was an apothecary chest.
Right. But it turns out that Watson held a degree. You know, a dresser is someone who assists surgeons and closes wounds and so on. And Watson, Miss Simpson points out, held the post of house physician or surgeon at St. Bartholomew's after he took a degree as a medical doctor in London, which was extremely difficult to maintain. So even before he had anything to do with the Army, Watson had some significant intellectual and skill accomplishments.
Yeah, I mean, that is probably one of the least realized facts here. I mean, yes, we all know that Watson knew Stamford from Bart's, and we all know Bart's is, you know, this great hospital. But really, the degree to which Watson applied himself and was rewarded. Well, we don't know how much he applied himself. We do know he received the rewards of someone who was thought to be quite competent. In fact, more so than competent. You know, getting an MD, you didn't have to get a medical degree to become a doctor in those years. That was additional study that Watson put in. And he said he was going to study even more at Netley, I believe. But this house surgeon at St. Bart's, that was a huge accomplishment. You know, this would have been, the pinnacle of a surgeon's career, certainly that early on. It bode well for what Watson was expected to do in his medical career.
Yeah. And it may have been because of his loyalty, his sense of patriotism, that he set his eye upon becoming an officer in the Army Medical Department. He tells us, you know, that was his desire.
Yeah, and that's interesting because, as Miss Simpson notes, the Army was considered a dead-end career for medical professionals at that point. So, you know, again, think back. This is late 1870s. Great Britain is enjoined in a war, the second Anglo-Afghan War, all right, back in Afghanistan. Go figure. It's all been done before and will be done again, as Holmes himself said. So he must have thought, well, how can I use my skills for the betterment of my fellow Britons? And, perhaps Watson got to Bart's, got to medical school by virtue of, you know, some patron, some favor being called in. We don't know that. But, you know, if he were to spend too much time at Bart's, perhaps his own assessment of his skills may have been true, and he was escaping. He was kind of staying one step ahead of things in terms of not being found out and applying his skills to the Army instead, where he could have just kind of blended in with the rest of the medical staff there.
Well, it's interesting. You know, you can impute these different scales of motivation to a character's behavior. On the one hand, maybe he wasn't deeply skilled. On the other hand, maybe he was very, very patriotic. Yeah. But the interesting thing is it's by June 1880, he's attached to General Burroughs' brigade, and he tells us in 1878 he got his degree. So it's in the intervening 2 years that he has been a house physician or surgeon at St. Bart's, and then went on to further training at Netley, so that by June of 1880, he's attached to a brigade which was defeated in the fatal Battle of Maiwand. So he wasn't a house surgeon at Bart's very long, maybe, no. I don't know how long the training period at Netley would have taken, but it doesn't look like he was a house surgeon there for more than a year, let's say.
Right, before he was found out. No, I'm putting more out there, but I mean, this is supposition, right? I mean, just like we would have to imagine that when Watson returned from the war in Afghanistan, from having been injured at Maiwand, he was probably suffering from PTSD. By his own statements, not thinking much of his own abilities. Well, this could be an indicator of imposter syndrome. We hear a lot about that these days. People exhibiting imposter syndrome, where they really are filled with self-doubt, even though they are accomplished individuals. And this, look, the tales of Sherlock Holmes are nothing more than a personal journal, right? From Dr. Watson. These are his thoughts. This is his impression of not only Holmes, but of himself. And that is the lens by which we are viewing his capabilities.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And clearly he does have a strong scientific background, because as he meets Sherlock Holmes with Stanford in that laboratory in Bart's, and Holmes has this incredible explanation of the Sherlock Holmes test, the discovery of a reagent that would be precipitated in hemoglobin and nothing else. Watson is really very cautious in the face of this extravagant claim, which, by the way, there's been no data, no data collected that apparently, to sort of support this discovery. But Watson's comment is, well, it seems to be a very delicate test, which is an extraordinarily tactful comment when probably many other people would have said, really? Are you sure?
Yeah.
Or if you'd been Sherlock Holmes, you would have said, oh, really? Where's the data?
Exactly. Well, Watson could have said, Mr. Holmes, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the precipitate. Well, we will precipitate to our sponsor quickly, and we will be right back with some discussion of Watson's emergency medical capabilities right after this word.
In 2021, the BSI Press features 3 new volumes. That's right, 3 volumes, including one from the manuscript series, one from the professions series, and one dedicated to the outgoing head of the BSI. First, the manuscript series, you'll hear about the Staunton tragedy, that is, the missing 3/4. Mike Whalen, the former head of the BSI, has edited this book, in which a number of authors take aim at the missing 3/4. You'll learn about rugby, you'll learn about the mystery, you'll learn about, many things in the latest manuscript series. And in the latest profession series, Michael Quigley and Marcia Pollock edit this volume that brings together corporals, colonels, and commissionaires as they look at military in the canon. And the third volume is A Quiet Air of Mastery, essays in honor of Mike Whalen as he steps down as the head of the Baker Street Irregulars. And that's edited by Les Klinger. All of these and more are available at BakerStreetIrregulars.com under the BSI Press section. Be sure to pick up your copy today.
Okay, we're back talking about Watson's medical capabilities. And, we talked about, as I mentioned in a previous episode, we talked about Watson and his medical practice and handing over to Dr. Anstruther or taking over the practice of other physicians. But we did want to talk about one specific area of this essay by Helen Simpson about Watson's response in crisis situations. You know, we have to imagine that Watson, having been a medical doctor in the war, would have been used to responding to what are essentially emergency medicine situations, crises that require an immediate response. They don't give Watson or any doctor a long time to really consider what's being done. They have to make snap judgments. And there are, I think, a good number of these in the canon that go beyond the trope, and we've had fun with this here before, of Watson's medicine of choice being brandy.
Yes, they do. And in fact, there's a lot in the canon that tells us he kept up with his professional reading. You know, in Sussex Vampire and the Stockbroker's Clerk and Sign of Four and the Golden Pince Nez, he's reading various journals and treatises on medicine and the medical profession, so that when he comes to actually act, he acts quite competently. You know, he dresses Victor Hatherley's thumb, of course, and the engineer's thumb, which is not the world's most difficult surgical task. But there's a chronological sequence of his actions that, are really very praiseworthy. He, in the cutting down of Beddington and the Stockbroker's Clerk and his delivery of artificial respiration in an attempt to bring Beddington back. And in another case of brandy, but in the reviving of Mr. Melas in The Greek Interpreter.
Now, that was interesting because that was, a cocktail that I don't know anyone in the Sherlockian world has tried. Watson revived Mr. Melas with the aid of ammonia and brandy.
Yes. Yeah, apparently if you have a cocktail made with ammonia and brandy, you can, for a brief interval, actually speak Greek, regardless of whether or not you know anything about the language. I don't know that anyone in literature has really figured out why that happens.
I've got the perfect name for that cocktail. It's the Alpha and the Omega. Oh, well, of course, in Wisteria Lodge, Miss Barnett was found having been drugged by opium. And, of course, the universal tincture for waking someone up from a drug-induced stupor is coffee. Coffee.
Yes. What you do is you hit someone with a sack of beans and then give them a double espresso.
I wonder if they had to order out from one of those frou-frou coffee drinks from Starbucks. I'll have a triple shot, mochaccino, whatever.
Yes.
Oh.
Wisteria Chino.
Yeah. Well, also, Lady Frances Carfax was put under by chloroform, and Watson attempted to, or did revive her using artificial respiration and, quote, every device that science could suggest, including the injection of ether.
Interesting, isn't it?
That's interesting. You would think that ether would be, again, a depressant, something that would actually put someone to sleep rather than stimulate them. But I'm not a doctor, nor do I play one on this podcast, so I can't speak to that.
No, but it's worth looking at the some of the annotations to sort of check that out, isn't it? And then in Priory School, Dr. Huxtable has this dramatic collapse in the sitting room at Baker Street, and Watson rubs his lips with brandy, which is, of course, ever present.
That led to a nickname back at the Priory School. Yeah. Thornycroft, Brandy Lips, Huxtable, I think is what it was. We tried.
And then in the case of the illustrious client, we have the evil Baron Gruner. And Watson does spring into action, bathing his face in oil, covering the raw surfaces with cotton wadding, and injecting morphine to reduce his suffering. And so, all of this shows that, Watson really does have a medical toolkit.
He really does. And look, we know that Holmes kind of insulted Watson in The Dying Detective, calling him, is saying his capabilities were mediocre at best, or his qualifications were mediocre at best. Well, again, Holmes is dealing in an unknown and very arcane kind of disease, something that, well, Watson, if he wanted to, as many ego-driven physicians might, when Holmes asked him if he knew anything of the Black Formosa corruption or Tapanuli fever, Watson could have said, well, of course I do, right? But he was honest. He said, no, I have no idea what those are. And it gave Holmes the ability to, bring in Culverton Smith and, the denouement of the case, of course. So Watson, even in his later years, recognized that there are limitations to his medical training. He was a general practitioner, obviously very, very capable at emergency medicine, but also aware of his own limitations.
Yes. Well, and clearly, too, he's had some successes. Just as many of Holmes's cases are not shown to us because they're not fantastic or extreme. His practice at this point is near Paddington, and a porter or a concierge at the station finds Hatherley stumbling off the train and brings him over because Watson has established some track record of considerable success. Watson says in that case, I was able to help him recover from this rather depressing long-term ailment. So clearly there's more to Watson than we know about in the stories, and more to Watson than Watson himself tells us.
And aren't we glad that Watson put more of himself into his writing than into his practice?
And that is far from a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes. Watson, you are a treasury of knowledge.